Good day, children. This is audio file 2 of Indigo. In audio file 1, we saw Gandhi's encounter with Shukla and how Shukla is able to persuade Gandhi to go to Champaran with him. Gandhi decided to meet the educated lawyers to find more about the injustice to the sharecroppers. While doing so, Gandhi realizes that the real problem is a fear of intimidation that the peasants suffer from, and as long as they live in fear of the British landlords, there is not going to be a solution. And hence, Gandhi suggests that going to law court is in vain. Louis Fisher points out this characteristic of Gandhi that makes him a true leader, a leader who identifies the real problem and wants to eradicate the issue at the grassroots level so that it does not recur. Now, continuing with the lesson. Most of the arable land in the Champaran district was divided into large estates owned by Englishmen and worked by Indian tenants. So now, Louis Fisher moves on to describe the injustice that was done to the sharecroppers in Champaran. Most of the arable land, the cultivable land in the Champaran district was divided into large estates owned by Englishmen and worked by Indian tenants. So the land was owned by British landlords and the Indian sharecroppers worked under them. The chief commercial crop was indigo. The landlords compelled all tenants to plant 3/20 or 15% of their holding with indigo and surrender the entire indigo harvest as rent. This was done by a long-term contract. So the chief commercial crop that they planted was indigo, and the landlord forced all the tenants to plant 15% of the land that they had taken with indigo and then return back the entire harvest of indigo as rent to the landlords. That means they couldn't get any profit from that. The entire crop had to be handed over to the British landlords. And this was done by long-term contract. Presently, the landlords learned that Germany had developed synthetic indigo. They thereupon obtained agreements from the sharecroppers to pay them compensation for being released from the 15% arrangement. So now remember, this 15% arrangement was agreed upon by the British landlords. Now, when they realized that synthetic indigo was developed by Germany, so naturally what happens? The demand for natural indigo falls. So, when the British landlords learned that Germany was producing synthetic indigo, they no longer wanted to cultivate natural indigo. So, very cunningly, they got another agreement from these illiterate sharecroppers saying that they were ready to free these sharecroppers from the 15% agreement provided they gave a large sum of money to the landlords for releasing them from this agreement. So that was cheating, because the sharecroppers are not aware that Germany has produced synthetic indigo and there is no demand for natural indigo. The sharecropping arrangement was irksome to the peasants and many signed willingly. So the 15% agreement was irksome. Irksome means irritating to the sharecroppers. They did not want it. So when the British landlords said that they were ready to free them from this 15% arrangement, some of them willingly signed the agreement so that they could be free from this. Some of them did not have the money, so they resisted. Those who resisted engaged lawyers. The landlords hired thugs. So some of them resisted and they engaged lawyers because they were not ready to give a huge amount of money to the landlords. So what did the landlords do? They hired thugs. Thugs means ruffians to deal with these sharecroppers. Meanwhile, the information about synthetic indigo reached the illiterate peasants who had signed and they wanted their money back. So those who had at first signed willingly to free themselves from the agreement and paid a huge amount to the British landlords realized that they were cheated. Why? Because there was no demand for natural indigo. Now, they went to the British landlords and demanded their money back. But will the British landlords give? No, they will not. So this is the injustice that happened to the sharecroppers in Champaran. At this point, Gandhi arrived in Champaran. So we know what has happened. Rajkumar Shukla has approached Gandhi, and Gandhi has now come to Champaran to save these sharecroppers. He began by trying to get the facts. We know that Gandhi had been meeting the lawyers to get information, first-hand information. First, he visited the secretary of the British Landlords Association. The secretary told him that they could give no information to an outsider. Gandhi answered that he was no outsider. So apart from meeting the lawyers, Gandhi decided to meet some high officials to collect information. So the first official that he went to visit was the secretary of the British Landlords Association. The secretary told him that they could give no information to an outsider. So the secretary refused to divulge any details to Gandhi. Gandhi said he was no outsider. In fact, he was a lawyer representing the Indian sharecroppers. Next, Gandhi called on the British official commissioner of the Tirhut division, in which the Champaran district lay. The commissioner, Gandhi reports, proceeded to bully me and advise me forthwith to leave Tirhut. So after meeting the secretary of the British Landlord Association, Gandhi went to meet the British official commissioner of the Tirhut division, in which the Champaran district lay. The commissioner was also rude to him and told him to immediately leave Tirhut division. So what do we understand? That they were not helpful to Gandhi. Gandhi did not leave. Gandhi was determined that he would help the sharecroppers of Champaran. Instead, he proceeded to Motihari, the capital of Champaran. Several lawyers accompanied him. At the railway station, a vast multitude greeted Gandhi. So Gandhi continued with the fight. He moved further and there was a huge crowd, multitude supporting him. The lawyers too were supporting him. He went to a house and using it as headquarters, continued his investigation, tried to find out more about the injustice done to these sharecroppers. A report came in that a peasant had been maltreated in a nearby village. So when this investigation was in the process, Gandhi one day got a report that a peasant was badly treated in a nearby village. So he decided to go and speak to that peasant. Gandhi decided to go and see. The next morning, he started on the back of an elephant. So he started his journey on the back of an elephant. He had not proceeded far when the police superintendent's messenger overtook him and ordered him to return to town in his carriage. So when he started the journey, there was a messenger from the police superintendent's office who came and informed him that he could not continue his journey and had to return back to Motihari town. Gandhi complied. He immediately consented. The messenger drove Gandhi home, where he served him with an official notice to quit Champaran immediately. Gandhi consented. He went back to Motihari, where the messenger served him with an official notice that he had to leave Champaran immediately. Gandhi was being asked by the officials to leave Champaran. Gandhi signed a receipt for the notice and wrote on it that he would disobey the order. Gandhi immediately signed on the receipt, stating that he had received the order, but he was not willing to obey the order, that he would disobey the British officials to leave Champaran. In consequence, Gandhi received a summons to appear in court the next day. So as a result of that, Gandhi was asked to report to the court because a case had been filed against him for disobeying British officials. All night, Gandhi remained awake. He telegraphed Rajendra Prasad to come from Bihar with influential friends. He sent instructions to the ashram. He wired a full report to the viceroy. So now a case had been filed against Gandhi, and there was every possibility that Gandhi would be arrested the next day. So Gandhi remained awake all night planning. He telegraphed Rajendra Prasad to come from Bihar with influential friends. Rajendra Prasad was also an influential lawyer. He was also asked to come with other influential friends to meet Gandhi the next day. He sent instructions to the ashram in case he gets arrested. There would be a delay in his return. So immediately he sent instructions to his ashram in Ahmedabad. He wired a full report to the viceroy. The highest official, the viceroy, also received a report from Gandhi stating about the injustice that was happening in Champaran. Morning found the town of Motihari black with peasants. So by morning, all the people in Champaran had come to know. Champaran and the neighboring districts all came to know about what had happened to the great figure who had come to save them. So they all crowded. They did not know Gandhi's record in South Africa. They did not know Gandhi's achievements in South Africa. They had merely heard that a Mahatma who wanted to help them was in trouble with the authorities. They were only aware that a great figure who had come to sort out the injustice in Champaran was in trouble with the British officials. So they all crowded to show their support to Gandhi. Their spontaneous demonstration in thousands around the courthouse was the beginning of their liberation from fear of the British. So it was not a planned gathering. Their spontaneous demonstration on the spur of the moment, when they heard about the arrest of Gandhi, they all just crowded there. They all crowded in thousands around the courthouse. And this was the beginning of their liberation, of their freedom from the fear of the British. That is exactly what Gandhi wanted to teach them. Gandhi said that going to the law court is in vain. Instead, the sharecroppers have to be taught to overcome their fear of the Britishers. So this was the first step when they, without fearing the British, crowded around the courthouse. The officials felt powerless without Gandhi's cooperation. So when there was a massive demonstration by these sharecroppers, the Britishers were unable to control them. They needed the help of Gandhi to control. He helped them regulate the crowd. Gandhi was very helpful. He helped to control the sharecroppers. He was polite and friendly. He was giving them concrete proof that their might, hitherto dreaded and unquestioned, could be challenged by Indians. So the officials were at the mercy of Gandhi here to control the unruly mob, that is the sharecroppers. And Gandhi, very politely, in a friendly manner, helped the Britishers to control the crowd. And this was a proof that their might, the Britishers' might, which was hitherto so far dreaded, feared, and unquestioned, could be challenged by Indians. So the first time the Britishers were aware that their might could be challenged by the Indians. The government was baffled. Even the government was amazed. They were shocked. The prosecutor requested the judge to postpone the trial. Apparently, the authorities wished to consult their superiors. Even the prosecutor wanted the judge to postpone the trial. Why? The reason, because they had never faced such a situation and they wanted to consult the higher authorities, their superiors. Gandhi protested against the delay. He read a statement pleading guilty. He was involved, he told the court, in a conflict of duties. On the other hand, not to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. On the other hand, to render the humanitarian and national service for which he had come. He disregarded the order to leave, not for want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being the voice of conscience. He asked the penalty due. This paragraph is very important. So, when the prosecutor requested the judge to postpone the trial, Gandhi protested against the delay. He said that it was not possible. He could not be in a state of indecisiveness. He read a statement pleading guilty. He said that he had committed an offense of disobeying the British officials and therefore they could go ahead and punish him. He was involved, he told the court, he confessed to the court, in a conflict of duties. There was a conflict of duties going on in his mind. On the one hand, not to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. He had broken the law by disobeying the officials. So he did not want to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. He, being a leader, should not have broken the law. On the other hand, not to set a bad example as a lawbreaker. On the other hand, to render the humanitarian and national service. So on the one hand, he had broken the law by disobeying the British officials. And on the other hand, why was he going? Why was he going to the place? Because he wanted to render humanitarian and national service. So he was serving the nation and he was doing a humanitarian deed by going to help the peasant who was ill-treated, for which he had come. So he was also helping out to sort the injustice done towards the sharecroppers of Champaran. So he was asked to quit Champaran, he disobeyed it. So thereby he had broken the law. He disregarded the order to leave, not for want of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being, the voice of conscience. He asked the penalty due. He disregarded the order of the British officials to leave Champaran, not for want of respect. Here, want means lack. So it was not for lack of respect for lawful authority, but in obedience to the higher law of our being. So he did not disregard the order to leave because he lacked respect for the British officials, but he decided to follow the dictates of his mind, the voice of his conscience that urged him to help sort the injustice done to the sharecroppers. So deliberately he had broken the law of disobeying the British officials because he wanted to help the poor sharecroppers. Therefore he was guilty. He asked the penalty due. He was ready to face the punishment. The magistrate announced that he would pronounce sentence after a 2-hour recess and asked Gandhi to furnish bail for those 120 minutes. Gandhi refused. The judge released him without bail. So the magistrate was not ready to pronounce the sentence because he knew the consequence. There was an unruly crowd outside who was controlled by Gandhi. So the minute Gandhi was arrested, there would be a mob outside. So he said that he needed a 2-hour break before which he could pronounce the verdict, and Gandhi was asked to take bail for those 2 hours. Gandhi refused. Gandhi challenged them to arrest him. The judge released him without bail. So there was a compromise. They were not ready to take up the challenge. They could not arrest Gandhi because they wouldn't be able to control the crowd outside. So the magistrate said that there was no need for bail. Gandhi was at liberty. Gandhi could be free for those 2 hours. When the court reconvened, the judge said he would not deliver the judgment for several days. After the 2 hours break, the judge came back and was not again ready to declare the verdict. He said that it would take a few days to declare the verdict and Gandhi could remain free. Rajendra Prasad, Brij Kishore Babu, Maulana Mazrul Huq and several other prominent lawyers had arrived from Bihar. They conferred with Gandhi. What would they do if he was sentenced to prison? Gandhi asked. Why? The senior lawyer replied they had come to advise and help him. If he went to jail, there would be nobody to advise and they would go home. So Gandhi had on the previous day asked Rajendra Prasad to come with some influential lawyers in case Gandhi gets arrested. When they came, they all had a conference. They conferred with Gandhi. What would they do if he was sentenced to prison? Gandhi asked. So an important question Gandhi asked them. In case the verdict is passed after a few days and Gandhi gets arrested, so then what would happen? What would be the consequence? All the senior lawyers replied that they had come there because Gandhi had asked them to. And they had come there, and if Gandhi gets arrested, there was nobody to help, and so they would go back to their homes. Here, again, Gandhi takes up the role of a good leader and brings back their focus on the initial problem, that is, the injustice done to the sharecroppers. So he brings back their focus on the initial problem and tells that Gandhi is not the focus, it is the sharecroppers. So their first priority should be to help the sharecroppers and not Gandhi. What about the injustice to the sharecroppers? Gandhi demanded. So when the lawyers said that they would go home because Gandhi was in jail, Gandhi asked them, then what happens to the injustice done to the sharecroppers? The lawyers withdrew to consult. Rajendra Prasad has recorded the upshot of their consultations. They thought among themselves that Gandhi was totally a stranger, and yet he was prepared to go to prison for the sake of the peasants. If they, on the other hand, being not only residents of the adjoining districts, but also those who claim to have served these peasants, should go home, it would be a shameful desertion. So, Gandhi is able to bring back their focus on the real problem, that is, they had all gathered in Champaran to sort out the injustice, to solve the injustice that was done to the sharecroppers. So when Gandhi points it out to them, they go back. Again, they have a consultation and they come back. When they consulted each other, it was brought out that Gandhi, being a stranger, was ready to go to jail for the cause of the sharecroppers. And they, who had these are lawyers who had been fighting the case all along. And if they do not have that sincerity, it would be a shameful desertion, abandoning of this cause. They accordingly went back to Gandhi and told that they were ready to follow him into jail. So after consulting each other, after finding a solution, they come back to Gandhi and tell him that they are ready to continue this fight against this injustice and they are ready to follow Gandhi to jail. Gandhi is elated. He says the battle of Champaran is won. So even if Gandhi goes to jail, there are others who will fight for the cause of the sharecroppers, and therefore the battle of Champaran is won. He exclaimed. Then he took a piece of paper and divided the group into pairs and put down the order in which each pair was to quote arrest. So Gandhi is now the leader who is fighting the cause. In case Gandhi goes to jail, there will be another pair who will take up the fight, and if that pair gets arrested, the next pair would continue the fight. In this way, he writes down the order in which they would fight the case. Several days later, Gandhi received a written communication from the magistrate informing him that the Lieutenant Governor of the province had ordered the case to be dropped. So they were aware of the consequence now. In case Gandhi gets arrested, what would be the result? So that would be instigating the sharecroppers into further anger. So after a few days, earlier the magistrate had told that the verdict would be pronounced after a few days. Now Gandhi receives a letter, a written communication from the magistrate saying that the Lieutenant Governor has asked to drop the case against Gandhi. Civil disobedience had triumphed the first time in modern India. We know that civil disobedience was a peaceful weapon used by Gandhi to speed the departure of Britishers from India. So this was the first time Gandhi had used civil disobedience as a weapon, and he had succeeded. So Gandhi had disobeyed the British authorities' order to leave Champaran, and now there was no case against Gandhi. They had dropped the case against Gandhi. So now that he was free from this case, Gandhi and the lawyers now proceeded to conduct a far-flung inquiry into the grievances of the farmers. Now Gandhi continued with his fight against the injustice done to the sharecroppers. He tried to find out more about the injustice that was done. He did a far-flung inquiry. Depositions by about 10,000 peasants were written down and notes made on other evidence. He was collecting a lot of evidence speaking to the sharecroppers. Documents were collected. The whole area throbbed with the activity of the investigators and the vehement protests of the landlords. And so He was collecting a lot of documents, and there was a lot of meeting happening between the sharecroppers and these lawyers under the leadership of Gandhi. So this brings us to the end of audio file 2 of Indigo. Thank you, children.